So good morning. We would like to welcome everyone to Moving Upstream, and thank you for joining us in this conversation today. So we first would like to thank our sponsors for this event, CMHA of Windsor, Essex, and Hotel Du Healthcare. So thank you for your generous support. And I invite everyone to just introduce themselves. You can use the chat feature. And introduce yourself, let us know who you are and what organization or community you're coming from. That would be great.
So this is the first of two sessions that we're focusing on addictions and in particular complex trauma, and how the Windsor Essex community can collaborate to improve our support systems that allow people to achieve their full health potential on all areas of life: physical, spiritual, emotional, and relational. So I'm Bob Cameron. I'm the director of REACT Windsor Essex and one of today's moderators. And I'm going to ask Kristen to give a bit of her background as well.
I am Kristen Stockford. I am the program coordinator for REACT Windsor, and also a person who has lived experience with complex trauma. So I'll just give you a bit of a rundown on today's events. So we're going to start by looking at what do we mean by moving upstream at 8:40. And then we're going to hear a little bit from Tim Fletcher at 9 o'clock. At 9:30, we're going to have an interactive Q&A where you'll have an opportunity to ask Tim some questions as well. We're going to look at some stories from people that have experienced complex trauma and gone through the REACT program. At 9:55, we have a couple different workshops for you, one with Tim and one with Leslie Allen, and we'll tell you a little bit more about both of our speakers as we get closer to that. 10:45, we're going to move into breakout rooms and have some guided conversations. 11:15, hear a little bit more from Tim with another interactive Q&A, and we'll be wrapping up at around 12 o'clock. So thank you to everyone for the introductions. I'm seeing lots coming in the chat. Also important for us that we do a land acknowledgement. So today, we meet on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. We respect the longstanding relationships with First Nations people in this place, in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits, Le Detroit of Detroit.
There's something significant about our land acknowledgement and the overlapping with the conversation of complex trauma. And so we need to acknowledge this morning that the core of our conversation today is framed by the history of our county and the generational trauma experienced by the community that welcomed our ancestors years and years ago. So I hope our conversation today deepens our grasp of the gravity of our shared history and could help us as a city shape a maturing response for conciliation with those who welcomed us generations ago. I'd like to introduce you to a bit of who REACT Windsor Essex is, and then the gist of the theme of moving upstream. REACT Windsor Essex is a 12-week program each day of the week for the morning that focuses on complex trauma, seeing that is the driver, the engine of so much of mental health concerns and addictions. And our core goal is to get beyond the surface and focus at the deep wounds experienced in childhood that have shaped the brain, shaped the responses we have, and what protected us as children now serves us in destructive manners. And so the goal of REACT, which is Recovery Education for Addictions and Complex Trauma, is to be an outpatient program that allows our participants to take what they learn in the morning, to take it back to their environments that they live in, interact with the material, and bring their stories back the next day. So day in, day out, there's a weaving together of what is learned and built day in, day out of what the program teaches, and applying it right into my life of learning new tools and applying them into adversity and pain that continues to go on through our lives. And so REACT provides a safe space for individuals to experience and heal from personal trauma and take back control of their lives again. We run it through 3 phases. The first 4 weeks is a comprehension and an information-laden understanding of how trauma shapes the brain and our relationships. After the 4 weeks, we move into 8 weeks, where each week we focus on a specific subject, things like emotions and grief and shame and boundaries. And in that, have an understanding of a deepening understanding of how our trauma has affected us. The aha, we say the connecting of the dots goes on in our lives between our stories of the past and the present decisions we don't want to make that happen anyways. And then learning new tools and implementing them into our lives of how we respond to adversity. And after our cohorts graduate, there's an ongoing phase 3, which provides support and care for each of the cohort graduates to connect them with a group that understands their story, that resonates, their hearts resonate together, and we learn new tools that help us implement, learn new tools that we can implement in our lives. We also provide wraparound supports of coaching and counseling to help folks as they move through and their stories begin to unfold. Additionally, we appreciate the support of the community. That, as we all know, no one program can solve a problem for someone, that it really does take a community to support and see people grow. So we're thankful that you're present here today. The theme of Moving Upstream was the sense that this is just the beginning of the story, in a sense, for us. And that our goal in increasing awareness of complex trauma in the Windsor-Essex community was to launch REACT, the 12-week program in the ongoing phase 3. But then we began to think of this idea of we're continually pulling people out of the water and resuscitating them. And that's acts of compassion and care for people. But at some point, we need to be able to look up the river and say, why are folks falling in? And how do we move upstream to begin to look at the systemic challenges that are creating trauma in people's lives? And can we get to a point where we can address it before it becomes so damning in people's lives? And so we've begun to imagine what that could look like. That if REACT Windsor-Essex moves forward, how could we as a community impact areas moving forward closer and closer to the source of trauma? And so we've begun to work with hand-in-hand recovery homes in providing the material for the men and women that enter into their homes, realizing the impact is with their children. As we begin to work with them, the adults involved, they have their parents, they have children in their lives, and we can stop the cycle. We are looking at launching a program called ACCEL, ACCEL, which is the REACT curriculum designed for ages 12 to 17. So we're in the process right now of the funding to support to hopefully launch that in January of 2022. And it begins to look at getting to the awareness and the understanding of trauma in children's lives before habits become too ingrained, and giving them hope and an alternative way forward. We're looking to start that with children of our cohort graduates, so that the children that are the youth that are involved in that program go into a home where there's an understanding of complex trauma and sharing the language. Other areas that we have an opportunity or this potential for moving upstream and imagining this as working with the Indigenous community. And likewise, a new program called En Route, which takes a harm reduction model of meeting those who are living on the streets in places like H4 or the Mission, places where they gather, and introducing them to the concept through one-off modules of complex trauma and beginning to prepare them in the pre-contemplation, the contemplation model, that when they land in safe, stable housing, they could enter into the REACT program or other programs across the city. Likewise, there's opportunity for REACT to be run in the evening for those who are still working, able to function in their trauma or addictions and taking the program in the evening. But ultimately, seeing that there's a support for families. How do we help parents learn how to create a healthy environment for raising their children? And last but not least on this is the justice system. So many of the men and women in our detention center at Southwest and other places incredible proportion of traumatization in their lives. And how do we help them? And as we do interviews with them, as they look at leaving the court system and entering into REACT or a support program, realizing how many children they have and the opportunity for us to influence them as parents to change the environment and stop the cycle again of complex trauma. So that's our theme for Moving Upstream. We balance the somewhat the tension of the urgency and the element of compassion for those that are we come into encounter with and that we love and we care for, but also beginning to think or to spend time and energy in thinking, how do we move upstream to address the problem, and that we can have an impact 20 years from now. Too hard to see it now, but limiting the impact it has on the next generation. So thank you for participating today in this. We hope it's informative, certainly expect it to be, but also getting your feedback in the conversations we have in breakout rooms and so on later on. And to keep that idea of moving upstream in mind and having a lens on it that you could give insight for us as well, that we can help shape this conversation. Thanks very much. I'd like to introduce Tim Fletcher for us now. 2 years ago, I suppose before that, our networks intersected between Tim and DWCC, and heard of what he was doing in Winnipeg for several years when it came to addressing complex trauma and addictions and caring for folks that we care for. What we found is that being a good neighbor, DWCC attempting and bringing people together, was that wasn't enough, that there's a critical factor in people's lives that we need to help them beyond just being a good friend. And as we heard Tim's story and what he was doing, that we need to bring that to Windsor. And so Tim came 2 years ago in November, and we had an overwhelming response to a one-day workshop with Tim on complex trauma. He comes with 20 plus years of experience working in addictions, whether it's through his pastoral work or counseling work. And Tim has an incredible brain that's able to collate all the information that's just flowing out now on trauma and to systematize it. I don't like the word package, but to put it in a presentation word, a way and manner that when folks encounter it, the aha light goes on. They connect the dots. They say, that's why I do what I do. This makes sense in my life. And we see in people the shedding of stigma and shame as they realize the reason their story is as it is. And so we're grateful for Tim's willingness to participate with us and then to move to Windsor. So Tim and I are walking buddies down at the river on Friday afternoons. So I really appreciate his support and his insight, and now a Windsorite with his wife. So I'm going to pass it over to Tim, and thanks, Tim, for being here.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome, everybody. In case you didn't know, I first came to Windsor in 1982. I was hired by General Motors in Oshawa in 1980, and then after 2 years got moved to Windsor, and I was here for 4 years before we moved to Winnipeg. I left General Motors and then ended up in this whole field. So I, believe it or not, actually loved Windsor when I lived here, and everybody thought I was crazy. And so when we talked about coming back and that the winters in Winnipeg were getting so difficult, our daughters came, 2 daughters came here and loved it. So we thought, okay, let's make the move ourselves. So we did, and we're glad we did. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint notes with everybody so that you can see what we're going to be talking about. So the quote that Bob's been referring to is from Desmond Tutu, and it's, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And that really is what has been happening in the world of addiction, is let's stop dealing with the symptoms and let's go find out why people are ending up in addiction in the first place. And let's deal with the root issues behind addiction. So that's really where I got my start in beginning to understand that the root addiction, or the root issue around addiction, was complex trauma. So part of what I struggled with in preparing this seminar is I did a seminar 2 years ago and I didn't want to repeat it. I wanted to come at it from a couple different directions that if you were at the first seminar would just add to your understanding of complex trauma. But if you weren't part of the first seminar, there is stuff available that you can watch or take part of to become more familiar with the material. So what I want to focus on just to get us started is just a little while ago, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's been working for 40 years in child psychology or psychiatry, brain development and trauma. And he just paired up with Oprah Winfrey to produce a book that I think is just excellent. It's the 40 years of his research and work kind of distilled into a very systematic layout of understanding trauma and the brain. And basically, the title is What Happened to You? And the context of that is most of our social services have looked at people by saying, what's wrong with you? So you have a mental illness. Okay, we're going to put you over here in this silo. Oh, you're a criminal. We're going to put you here in this silo. And it's all based on the symptoms. What's wrong with you? And again, it's Bruce Perry is saying, let's move upstream and say, what happened to you to cause you to have those symptoms? What that has then led to is understanding that, like I said, 97% of addicts have complex trauma or complex PTSD. Over 90% of people in prison, research is showing that they have complex PTSD. Over 90% of homeless people have complex trauma. Mothers who have children in the CAS system, most of those mothers have complex trauma, and it's inhibiting their ability to be a mother. And so the whole point is, if the social services would start to work together and say, hey, we're all dealing with the symptoms of a common root, that would transform how we approach so many of the problems that we have in society. So I just really appreciated what Dr. Bruce Perry said, because it just coincides so much with my own thinking over the years as I've researched and understood this better and better. And so that's kind of the premise behind a lot of what I'm going to be saying. Another renowned traumatologist, John Briere, said if complex trauma or complex PTSD were given its due, and I can't even read the whole thing, so you guys can read it, but it's basically saying that so much that is found in the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is really pointing out symptoms of trauma. And so he said, if we really begin to understand trauma, then the DSM would shrink to the size of a thin pamphlet, because it's not necessarily a mental illness, it's patterns of how people are behaving in response to trauma. And I found, again, that just quite helpful. You might be quite interested. This is research out of the States, but it's the cost of trauma. And so cancer, 216 billion, diabetes, 245, heart disease, 313, but trauma, $671 billion is being spent in the healthcare system on trauma. And that's probably a very low number. And so the number one cause of death in the States is now being seen as trauma. Another, I don't know, I thought I had it here, but I watched a documentary of a bunch of researchers and doctors, and they said that in the medical system in the West, particularly states in Canada, over 90% of the diseases that are being dealt with now are related to stress. And so we're a culture that is spending billions of dollars on the consequences of trauma. And so it's just to create a greater awareness that, okay, we're starting to get a picture that says we have to change how we do things and become more trauma focused. trauma aware, trauma informed, and I wholeheartedly agree. So let's go to what's the definition of trauma? And it's quite a challenging thing for people to agree on. And so what's come out of all of the discussions around trauma specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, is there has to be 3 E's that are true. So the event is E number 1. And so think of a fire in a school, in a public school. And so let's imagine you have 3 people that are going to be involved with that fire. Number 1, you have a fireman. Number 2, you have a child in grade 1, and the fire's taking place in his classroom. And then you have a child in grade 6, but he's at the other end of the school, and the fire's quite a distance from him, okay? So that leads to the second E, B, the experience. What happened to their stress response system? What happened inside of them when the event took place? And so Dr. Gabor-Mate says, trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. And so for a firefighter, they're going to be alert because they know fires are dangerous, but they're not going to be traumatized by it because they're experienced, they have tools for handling it. The child at the other end of the school in grade 6, they're curious, this is kind of fascinating, they're not going to be traumatized by it. But the child in grade 1, where the fire's in their classroom, they're traumatized by it because this is an overwhelmingly scary thing that could mean death, and they don't have the tools to handle that. So the experience becomes the second E, and then the third E is the effects. So does it still affect the person months later? Does the stress response of that event continue to be their response months later or years later? And do the things they did to survive continue to be their ways of coping today? So those are all the things that would then say, okay, that person has PTSD, they've been traumatized. So they have to have all 3 E's. So that leads to the next question. What is the difference between PTSD versus CPTSD? And so it's such an important concept or important thing to be clear in your thinking on. So PTSD versus CPTSD. So the first thing I want to say is there's differences, but they overlap. So we deal with complex trauma or complex PTSD because it does the greater damage. But for the most part, society has focused on PTSD and therapies to deal with CPTSD, which is great. It's very important. But a lot of people think that, okay, that's all there is to trauma, and they don't fully understand complex trauma. So PTSD, to start there, is what some call big T trauma, one event trauma. So a car accident, a rape. And what happens when a person is in a trauma event? They're overwhelmed by danger, overwhelmed by the possibility of great hurt. They don't have the tools to handle it. They're not strong enough. They're not fast enough. So their brain adapts and their stress system is activated. So cortisol is released, epinephrine's released to give them the energy to fight or flight, or they freeze, and that enables them to survive. And so that's the one event trauma. But the key thing is once the event has passed and they survive, the brain returns to the pre-adaptation behavior. So the stress system is deactivated. So they're not on alert anymore. They go back to being able to love people, to be able to trust people. All of that goes back to a very normal existence. But for many people with severe single event, big T trauma, they do have ongoing effects. So PTSD The ongoing effects, flashbacks, nightmares, memories, invasive memories. All of a sudden, there's a sense of avoidance for them of going certain places that remind them of the trauma, or they just avoid talking about the topic. They have trouble sleeping or concentrating. They find themselves more hypervigilant, especially in certain situations. And then they can start to have some mood swings. So depression, anxiety, getting angry very quickly. And then they can get these new triggers, things that trigger them to go into fight or flight, or a trigger is something that causes them to be dysregulated emotionally. So they go from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond, or they have this hyperactive startle response. So somebody comes up behind them, touches them on the shoulder, and they jump out of their skin. So that would be considered PTSD ongoing effects, and that would be what the therapy focuses on. And so part of the key with that is PTSD affects mainly the limbic part of the brain and the brain stem, and somewhat the cortex of the brain. So the therapy focuses a lot on the limbic brain and the brain stem, and a little bit on the cortex. So just keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that. So let's go to complex trauma or complex PTSD. And so the simple concept is that PTSD is referred to as simple trauma, and it's in terms of integers. So simple, one. So one-time event trauma, complex, more than one, ongoing. So complex trauma is a person or a child living in ongoing danger. And that ongoing danger can happen from two things. So number one, they can have severe ongoing big T trauma. So every day they see their dad get mad, throw things, hit mom, beat up them or their siblings. So living in that home is constantly being big T traumatized. Or it's going to school and every day the bully picks on them, beats them up, and nobody does anything about it. So they have ongoing abuse type trauma. And that can involve sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, or physical abuse. But that's not the only thing that causes a child to feel in danger. And this is where the concept of complex trauma now steers us in a different direction. A child can feel in just as much danger from stuff that would appear very mild to big T trauma type things. And it would come in the form mainly of neglect. So dad's a workaholic, mom's working different shifts than dad, so nobody is there for them. So their physical needs are being provided for, but their emotional needs aren't. The child can't connect with dad because he's always busy. The child can't connect with mom because she's not there when they're at home. And so they just feel all alone. Because of the neglect, they can feel partly abandoned. Then the next thing that ties in with the neglect is some of their 12 needs. So we've done a talk in the previous seminar on the fact that we have 12 needs, physical needs, and then we do a bunch of emotional needs, acceptance, connection, nurture, unconditional love, justice, all of that. And then we have safety needs, we have relational needs, spiritual needs. So we talk about all of those needs that every person has. So if a child only gets physical needs met, but they never feel accepted, they never are able to connect, then their emotional needs aren't being met. So they're living with this unresolved pain, frustration. They're trying to get it resolved, but it's not. And they just don't feel safe. They feel alone. So that's very subtle. Many would say, well, how can that be trauma? But from the perspective of the child, if you can't connect and you're not accepted, then the world's not a safe place. And so those become what more and more research is being done in understanding complex PTSD. It seems mild or subtle, but what they're seeing is it has just the same effects on the brain as big T ongoing trauma. Because in both cases, the response is the same. The stress system not just is activated for a short time like it is with big T trauma, but now because of ongoing danger, the stress system has to remain activated. And that becomes the key difference with complex trauma, is a stress system that remains activated, that can't relax. So that means that cortisol is pumping all the time in the brain. In PTSD, cortisol pumps for a very short time to give you the energy to fight or flight so you can get safe. In complex trauma, you can fight or flight, but you can never get safe. So cortisol keeps on pumping, and we're going to look at the damage that cortisol does to the brain, to the immune system, all kinds of stuff. Then norepinephrine keeps on pumping, so you've got that, and then your sympathetic nervous system can't relax, it has to stay active, and we're going to look at what that means because that does huge damage as well. And so complex trauma activates key systems in the body that alter the brain, alter every aspect of the body. Then the second part is that stress response system, because it's constantly activated, now starts to overreact whenever it thinks it sees danger. So it goes from 0 to 100 on a regular basis as just its way of survival. So those are the first two key things that happen physiologically within a person because of ongoing danger. But then the third thing, and this to me is one of the key things, and this is so much of what REACT is about, is so in PTSD, the brain adapted by fight, flight, or freeze. And then after they were back safe, it went to pre-adaptive states. But in complex trauma, because the danger is ongoing, you have to stay in fight, flight, freeze. You have to stay in the survival adaptation. So think of what is a survival adaptation. Well, you start lying. You don't trust people. You become fake with people just so they don't hurt you or so you get what you want. So those survival adaptations are necessary to survive, but they become maladaptive if you want to live a healthy adult life. Because if you don't trust people, if you lie, if you wear masks, you can't have a healthy relationship. You can't have a good job situation. So the adaptations that you had to stay in order to survive now are destroying your life and preventing you from having a healthy life. And so the adaptations have become maladaptive. And that is a key thing to understand about complex PTSD. But then there's a fourth thing, and this we do a lot of work on in REACT as well, is because ongoing danger changes our belief systems. So now we believe what we think is the truth when it in a healthy life is actually a lie. So if you go to the second one there, authenticity, a child in a healthy home realizes that if I want to connect with mom and dad and with people, I need to be authentic. I can't lie. I can't wear masks. I have to be open. I have to be honest. So authenticity equals connection. But what happens to a child in constant danger where they're not loved and accepted? They come into the world with a natural inclination to be authentic and their own personality. They ask questions, they do whatever their personality does, and they get laughed at, they get punished. Nobody wants to connect with them. And so what do they then start believing? Authenticity equals no connection. The exact opposite of the truth, but to them it is the truth. And so now when they go into adult life, they go, I still want to connect, but I can't be authentic. So how can I connect by being fake? And that becomes their approach to life, and it's based on a lie. And then what happens in a healthy child is, if I'm going to have healthy relationships and a healthy life, we have to trust each other. But what happens to a child in ongoing danger? If you trust people, they hurt you, they let you down. So you can't trust anybody. So their truth then becomes, trust always leads to pain. Trust always leads to bad things. Therefore, never trust. That is what they believe is the truth. And it sets them up for all kinds of problems. So all of these lies, and there's hundreds of lies, come out of complex trauma, because the child's experience says this is the truth, but it's actually a lie if you want to be healthy. So what I hope you begin to see is there's massive, deeper ramifications from complex trauma than there is from just PTSD. Okay, but then there's even, so let me just kind of summarize it and add a few things here as to ongoing consequences. So CPTSD, if they did have multiple big T trauma as part of their complex trauma, they're also going to live with flashbacks, triggers, hypervigilance, nightmares, all of that. They're going to have the lies and that they believe, but many of those they're totally unaware of. And then all of their maladaptive ways of coping, what's important to understand with that is that becomes part of the faulty program of their subconscious brain. And I'm going to explain that in more detail later today. So here's what I want you to see. Complex PTSD affects every part of life in a negative way. And I'm going to just be able to have time to go into a few of them today, but it affects the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, the mental health, brain development, physical health, emotions, thinking, and coping. And so it is massive in the damage that it does to people. So that's what makes PTSD versus CPTSD. Those are the differences. And complex trauma takes the damage to greater depths, ramifications than PTSD. So that's just a bit of an introduction. So let me go into some of the ongoing effects. So how does CPTSD change people? So it's important to understand, I think, for many people that when a person lives in constant danger and their stress system is constantly activated, it can begin to affect their five senses. And you may have clients who have extra sensitivity to light, and it could be tied into their trauma. And I've had many clients like that. Some are very sensitive to sound or to certain sounds, certain ranges of sound from high to low. We have clients that can't sleep unless there's kind of white noise in the background to drown out any other possible sounds. Some become very sensitive to hot, cold. So they can shiver all the time or sweat all the time at the slightest temperature changes. And they're seeing that a lot of that can be tied into complex PTSD. It does affect the five senses. What I think, people ask me all the time, what is the greatest damage done by complex trauma? And I would say it changes a person's identity from positive to totally negative. So in a healthy home where a child is unconditionally loved, where their needs are consistently met, they are gaining a belief and an identity that says, I must be lovable, I must have value, I must mean something. And I have these skills and I'm good at this. And they're gaining all of that positive self-identity. But what happens in a home where you're abused, you're neglected, your needs aren't met? The child at a very young age interprets everything egocentrically. And so it's all because of me. It's because of who I am. And so why am I neglected? It must be because I'm not lovable. It must mean because I'm not valuable. Why am I abused? It must be my fault. I must be a defect. I must be flawed severely. Why did my parents abandon me? Well, I must be a total zero. And so complex trauma, you can see, changes a child's core belief about who they are from positive to negative. So let me give you just this diagram. So in the center, you can see there's the real self. So complex trauma comes along and says the real self is flawed. It is not good enough. It is not lovable. So we call that, technically, that is called shame. It's the core belief that I'm not lovable, valuable, good enough. I'm less than, I'm inferior. And so what happens around that is in the brain, you develop this inner critic, and it's constantly criticizing everything you do. Oh, you're a loser. You can't do anything right. You'll never amount to anything. You're a screw up. It'd be better if you're never born. And so it's very hard on self. So it's believing the belief that the reason I was abused and neglected is because I'm not good enough. And so now I'm going to criticize everything I do to prove that I'm not good enough. But what then happens in the child is I still want to be loved. I still want to be respected. But how do I do that? Well, I can't be authentic. I can't let people see my real self, because then they would abandon me, abuse me, and neglect me as well, just like parents did. So I need to, third circle, create a persona. I need to wear masks. I need to adopt roles. I need to be funny, be a people helper, be super smart, be very pretty, be a flirt, whatever it takes to get people to value me, want to be my friend, and love me. And that persona then becomes what they want their person to be. But the problem is they know it's fake. And so they feel like a hypocrite. They have a syndrome that I'm a fake. And so they then go to the next circle, which is, if only I could be this, then everybody would love me. The problem is that the critic criticizes their persona constantly, says, yeah, it's fake. That's not the real you. The inner critic criticizes the ideal self's thinking, saying, yeah, but that's not the real you. And so they always end up back at shame, that you are not good enough. And so when you operate out of a shame core belief, and this is the very core of who you are, the belief about who I am, that affects how you approach everything in life. It affects how you approach relationships, jobs, new situations, etc. So if you look at complex trauma as kind of the epicenter of the earthquake, the first major piece of damage is shame. It changes the core identity, and then that leads to all of the further ripple effect of the earthquake in the damage that it does. So the change of identity, to me, is the core damage that comes out of complex trauma. And most people that go through REACT, we do in phase 2 a whole week on shame. Most of the cohorts would say that's their most significant week of insights, of making sense out of their life, at beginning to understand why they do what they do. But it's one of the hardest things to change because of that inner critic. So if somebody comes along and says to a cohort, you're really growing, I really like the personality that I'm seeing come out of you. You've got a lot of value, their inner critic says they're just saying that to be nice. They don't really mean it. If they really knew you, they would never say that. Or their inner critic says they're probably saying that to my face, but something different behind their back. So they've got all of these systems to discount anything that would change that core belief. It's a defense system that's multi-layered to prevent that core belief from ever changing. And so it takes a long time to undeal the damage of complex trauma in the area of shame. And then we've talked about the third effect is it just changes relationships. So understand this, and I think it's so critical. Complex trauma makes having a healthy relationship in adult life impossible. Because the very things you needed for survival are the very things that make healthy relationships impossible. So complex trauma sets a person up, if they don't deal with it, for all of their adult relationships to fail, to have trouble, major trouble that isn't resolvable. And that to me is just tragic, and it's part of what we're seeing in our culture and our society today, not just in domestic violence, but in all kinds of other ways as well. And then it changes the whole emotional makeup of a person's brain and world. So if you think of a child in a healthy home where they're loved, they're nurtured, it's safe, they feel secure, the design of the brain is it wants that, because the chemicals it wants to release in the brain are dopamine, the feel-good chemicals, serotonin, that feeling of connection and overall well-being, oxytocin, the feeling of love and connection, endorphins, the feel-good feelings from exercise, all of those things. So all of those are the brain's preferred chemicals that it wants to use, and they create feelings of love, happiness, pleasure, connection, well-being. So a child in a healthy environment is going to experience those the majority of the time. But what happens when you live in danger all the time? You don't get dopamine released. You don't get serotonin or oxytocin or endorphins released. Rather, you get cortisol and fear-based oxytocin, which is I need to run to you. So the child gets oxytocin releases, I need to run to mom or dad so they'll protect me. And the parent, when they see a child who is in pain, they get oxytocin release. They want to run and comfort the child. But what happens if the parents have complex trauma that they've never dealt with? They've shut down their oxytocin systems. They're not listening to them. So their child's in pain. They're not running to them. Their child runs to them and they say, get away, quit being a suck. Big boys don't cry. And the child doesn't get the necessary response to their oxytocin system, so they start to shut it down. So what I want you to see is in complex trauma, none of the desired chemicals are released in the brain. The chemicals that were designed to be released only in short spurts, like danger, PTSD, then you get cortisol, epinephrine release, so you have the energy to fight or flight, oxytocin, so you run to somebody for help and comfort. The situation is resolved, cortisol and all of those chemicals are gone, and dopamine, serotonin, and everything comes back. Complex trauma, you have cortisol all the time. And that is a fear-based thing, and it produces the energy. But here's what begins to happen. In a healthy child, most of the emotions are positive. And if they go into negative emotions, parents give them tools, comfort, and support to resolve them so they go back to positive emotions. Complex trauma, you're living in a negative emotional world. Not just the danger and the cortisol stuff in the brain, but the shame. And then now you're living with a feeling of hopelessness because you can't resolve your problems. constant depression and anxiety begin to happen. All kinds of different negative emotions begin to get added to the child's emotional world. And so it ends up being a very painful, dark world that they can't resolve, and nobody's helping them to resolve. And to me, it's one of the huge tragedies of the effects of complex trauma, is the effect on the emotional world. This graph on the left is trauma, complex trauma. You can have mild complex trauma to severe. So the more severe the trauma, the more the child is going to have shame. The more severe the trauma, the greater the anger issues the child is going to have, the greater the depression issues, the greater the anxiety issues. And what we're also seeing is the mental health issues begin to change as the child's trauma becomes more severe. And so it's changing the negative emotions, or it's changing the emotional world, so they're mainly negative, but the greater the trauma, the more powerful and intense those negative emotions become. So you can imagine, if I'm teaching this to clients, they're starting to feel quite depressed about what they're hearing, because they're beginning to realize, wow, complex trauma screwed me up big time. It has done damage, and now they're putting words to it, and they're identifying it and becoming aware of it. And for many of them, it can feel overwhelming. And then if you add, for some of them, what then begins to happen is, if they're parents, they think, oh man, I've done this to my kids. So now they're not just experiencing what they went through growing up. Now they're thinking about what they've done to their kids, and they're feeling tremendous guilt because of that. And that's causing them to feel even more overwhelmed and just depressed about what has happened in their life. And now the next generation effects of that is happening. So just before we open it up for questions, let me just end by saying this.
Notification.
When you look at trauma, complex trauma, it can happen from a bully at school. So an outsider, if you look at the indigenous world, it happened from colonialism, from outsiders. But then what happened, if the people didn't deal with that, then they began to take it out on their children. And so it went to the next generation. But now what are the children mainly getting traumatized by is the people closest to them, the people that love them. And then if you carry that through a couple generations, what you begin to realize is that fewer and fewer people within that culture are healthy. More and more people within that culture are traumatized and don't know how to resolve it. And so that becomes the generational effect of complex trauma, that with each generation, you see greater damage done, and it's being done by the people closest to you. The people that are supposed to love you are now the ones that are causing the trauma. And so that is, again, just another sad tragedy of complex trauma. So we're a couple minutes before 9:30, but we started a little bit early. So I think we'll open it up for questions, and Kristen's been collecting them, and she can share them with me.
Hi, Tim. Thanks so much for speaking. It's always informative and enlightening, and helps us all towards getting a better understanding and moving towards healing. So I will go to the chat, and feel free to drop any questions in the chat you may have, and I'll relay them to Tim. So first question, does CPTSD function in the same way when experienced as an adult if your childhood was relatively healthy?
It's a very good question. Yes, it does. So let me just give an example and show you two pieces to it. So there's been some people that had a relatively healthy childhood. Then they got married and ended up in a relationship that was verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, physically abusive. So they then were in a trauma environment, a complex trauma, ongoing danger environment. And then their symptoms for complex trauma all start coming out in adult life. So that very much can happen. Or they ended up with a chronic illness or a mental health illness, depression, anxiety that couldn't get resolved. And so they just constantly felt in this danger because of either chronic physical or mental health issues. And it has a traumatizing effect, and they get the symptoms of complex trauma. They go into fight or flight or freeze. What I would say to people usually with that is a person who came from a very healthy home would have tools to have handled most of that stuff, or would not have got into an abusive type relationship in the first place. So I would look for any cracks in the foundation of your upbringing, any tools that your family didn't give you. So they might have given you 90% healthy tools, but they might not have given you some tools that then set you up to fail later in life and be traumatized. Or there might have been very subtle shame messages that came through that you didn't even realize, but they set you up to be attracted to somebody who would be abusive and reinforce all that shame stuff. So I would look for things in your family of origin that might have been 90% great and healthy, but I would look for the 10% and try to understand how did that affect you and potentially set you up to experience complex trauma in your adult life. You're muted there, Kristen.
Thanks so much. Next, always has to be at least once on a Zoom meeting. Somebody has to stay muted. So next question is, what effect have you seen in immigrants coming from war-torn environments on parents, on children? Does CT help inform?
Excellent question. I think what we're seeing now is we're dealing with complex trauma more and more, not just because of the Indigenous situation and just our own domestic stuff, but now with immigrants coming in. So there's been, Bruce Perry actually cites some of this research that is being done on immigrants, but also on racial minorities. So Black people, Hispanic people, Latino, and beginning to realize that a lot of them just living in a predominantly white culture, they've experienced complex trauma because of how they were treated. Immigrants coming out of war-torn countries come with their complex trauma. The problem with a lot of those things is a lot of the countries that they came out of, you don't talk about that stuff. And so they come here and they're not going to go to a program that deals with trauma because that to them has a stigma. That to them shows weakness. You don't talk about that and you don't trust white men type of thinking. And so a lot of the people that come needing help badly aren't reaching out for trauma help because of a lot of the stuff that comes out of their culture. I think if you look at a lot of our world today, so communist countries basically are complex trauma countries. So one way to understand complex trauma is any system or family where the person in authority abuses that authority. And so countries that are corrupt, countries where there's not justice, all of those become complex trauma countries. And so it's not just within families, it's within nations and countries. And then beyond that, a lot of the cultures of the world are what I would call shame-based. So it's all about, you don't make me look bad. So the kids are pressured to behave so they don't make the parents look bad. And so there's stigma about everything that would make the parents look bad. And shame-based cultures are basically complex trauma cultures. So then I get asked, well, how much of our culture has complex trauma? And there's actually some research that's being done to try and help us better get a sense of that. But the latest I read just about a month ago was they're now thinking that potentially over half of Western culture is dealing with complex trauma. And that's kind of a scary thought. But I would say from my experience that, yeah, I would probably agree with that.
All right, next question. Why do we continue to subconsciously repeat the same patterns and unhealthy patterns when we know they will hurt us, but we think we can change it? And become addicted to that behavior by connecting with this person, thinking we can help them along the way, yet not aware we are hurting ourselves in the process.
So I'm going to hold that question because I'm going to cover that in part 2 today.
All right. Next question. A person becomes informed of trauma's effect. How long before a new normal occurs?
Okay, I'm going to talk about that in part 2 as well.
All right. What are some ways you've seen generational trauma halted? How do communities, families heal from generational trauma when it seems like the very water they are swimming in?
So that becomes part of the challenge, is you're trying to heal in a fish tank that has toxic water. And so some people have to get out of that fish tank for a while to a safe place where they can just work on themselves, get strong enough, do their own healing. Others are able to create safety within that toxic environment and stay within it. But it really depends on kind of the person. So some need to go out of the storm into a greenhouse for a while. Others can create their own mini greenhouse in a storm. But they do need to have a certain amount of safety where they can use the new tools. Part of the challenge then for them becomes is they almost have to use 2 toolboxes. When they're with safe people, they use the healthy tools. When they're back in a toxic, unsafe environment, they have to use the survival tools. And so that for some is just too hard to do. And that's why they got to get out of it. I think the bottom line that I would say is it really happens one person at a time. And if we can help parents who then change, then that changes how they parent and their children can heal. And then it begins to spread and it gradually changes the culture. If we can get the leaders of a culture to see the need for this and do all they can to support us helping individual families, making services available, then that speeds up the healing process. I don't think government can just say we're going to be trauma informed and everybody all of a sudden is trauma informed. It's got to go much deeper than that. And it has to be very practically boots on the ground, working with individuals who then influence their family, their sphere of influence, and it slowly spreads. So it's possible, but I think we have to understand and accept up front that it is a slow process, probably slower than we would like. But if we accept that it is a slow process, I think then we're going to be able to see in 10 years that, yeah, things are changing.
Thanks again. Another question. So how do you see CPTSD manifesting in a global local pandemic? Are the reactions symptomatic of original traumas or trauma itself? I imagine it's a combination of both. but I wonder how it works itself out and heal in a time of global and local crisis.
Well, COVID and isolation has been terrible for people with complex trauma. So let me just give you a few things around that. The healing part of this journey, which we'll talk about next week, is people have to connect. You can't heal without connection. But what has COVID done? It has created lack of connection, isolation. That can be okay for introverts, but for many extroverts, they need more than just Zoom connection, which might be okay for introverts. They need in-person connection, and that hasn't been possible. So the isolation is very difficult. And so that's why I think after 3 months of COVID, when studies were starting to happen, relapse rate was up 30%, domestic violence was up 30%, mental health issues were up 30%. And so all of a sudden you're realizing, okay, these are all the people with complex trauma, and COVID is having a negative effect on them, and they're regressing. I think the next piece for people with complex trauma to heal is they need routine, they need structure, they need to be productive, they need to do stuff every day. And COVID just threw all of that out. You're sitting at home, you're bored, you're lonely, you're out of your routine. And that just causes so many things to start surfacing. It triggers a lot of trauma stuff, and it causes people to get this antsiness, this discontent that drives them back to, I don't know how to resolve this, so I need to medicate it. I need to distract myself with or food, gambling, whatever activity numbs it, or drugs, alcohol, medication. So the pandemic, to me, has exposed the reality that complex trauma is a very serious thing. And if people don't have tools to deal with it, it's something like COVID that all of a sudden makes their life a whole lot worse because of the multiple things that it triggers.
Thanks again. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to wrap up the Q&A. So just wondering if there's any education being given to medical doctors, as so many diseases are related to trauma from childhood.
Good question. I don't know the precise answer, but I'll tell you what I do know. So Bruce Perry shares, I think it was on a podcast, that when complex trauma first came out, and I've experienced this, when I first started teaching about complex trauma, I had doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists say to me, that's not proven, that you're just making that up, there's no evidence for it. And Bruce Perry says that's pretty much the normal response when there's a new way of looking at things in the medical world. And then, so they ignore it, they criticize it. But then after more and more research comes out, then they gradually begin to adopt it. But it's a very slow process. And so people that pioneer a new way of looking at things really have to endure quite a bit of persecution, quite a bit of negative feedback. And that's very much what's happened with CPTSD. It's getting to the point now where it is becoming accepted. There's enough research to prove what happens in the brain, the changes in the brain, the body stuff. What I am finding in dealing with people who take a counseling degree, I haven't got tons of information around psychiatrists or psychologists that's new. I've got some older stuff and talking to some of them, but they only get a few classes around this material. And so that's why I say to some of our clients, you probably know more than your psychiatrist does about complex trauma, which is sad to say, but I think that's changing. And that to me is good. I don't know that, like my own doctor, when we were in Winnipeg, when I would go to for an appointment, he would often ask me questions about addiction and trauma because I don't know anything about this stuff. This is new. So I don't know where the medical field is at as far as GPs in making them understand this trauma stuff, but I think overall things are improving.
Thank you again, and thank you to everyone for all the great questions. Really encourages conversation to help us all learn a little more and get a little more insight. So since we launched in October, we've had over 100 people go through the REACT program. And Alex, our program director, is going to share a couple of their stories with you.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see everybody here. So I'm the Director of Operations for REACT Windsor Essex. And one of the things that I do is I participate in the facilitation of our daily programming. And personally, I find that so fulfilling. I'm able to interact with clients and journey with them as they make these discoveries, like Bob said earlier, these aha moments through the curriculum, as Tim shared, through the community of creating environments that are safe, where they're able to explore some of these concepts around trauma. And it really is a journey, and a journey that I think we're all on, right? And if anybody thinks they have arrived, I'm gonna post the link to the application for REACT in the chat, and please feel free to sign up, because none of us really have arrived. And this journey in REACT ends with a ritual that we do every Friday in graduation. So we celebrate the 12-week successful completion of the program with handmade blankets from Tim and Brittany, affirmations from their peers, words of encouragement from their counselors and facilitators, and a certificate of graduation. And we do that all together. And that's kind of a long intro to one of the storytelling pieces where, just for confidential, we're not going to use names, but a female graduate is what we'll show you. Is she read a letter at graduation where she was writing to her younger self, and this was suggested to her by her counselor throughout the program, and it was quite lovely. And the second, that would be the second storytelling. And the first storytelling is a man who was in our first cohort when we launched last October. And you'll see me interviewing him about his experience with REACT. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you can enjoy this segment of storytelling. Hi, I'm with REACT graduate, and just want to ask a few questions and maybe share a little bit about your experience. And the first question I want to ask you is, what was, I guess, the quality of your life, or perhaps some of the things that you were struggling with before you entered the REACT program?
I remember I sat down with Bob, and when we talked about this program, and he asked me what my expectations of this program were, my hopes for this program. And I simply told him I wish the thoughts in my head could slow down and not be so out of control.
Thank you. And if I could ask you, when you started taking the program, you were actually our first cohort when we launched the program. What was that experience like for you, the 12-week program?
The first thing that I definitely noticed in this program is the patience. And it didn't seem like we were rushed, and definitely felt very safe. Confidentiality I knew was going to be kept in this program. And from there, I was able to open up a lot more.
That's wonderful. And if I could ask you one final question, now that I think you have at least 6 months removed from the program, how do you find your quality of life now after the program? And do you think that the program has made a difference in your life?
Oh, no doubt. And I say this to members of my family as well as my friends, that I feel even at the age of 49, this is the best brain has ever worked in life. I'm able to grasp things and follow along quite easy with even simple things like watching a TV program. I'm able to follow the program without having to stop, pause, rewind, and ask questions. So I'm more focused on in the moment.
That's amazing. And me being along with you in that journey, I know that this is just a brief segment, and I know how there were so many more things that you've gained from this program.
To my younger self. Hi, how are you? It's me, you as an adult. You're 43 now, going to be 44 tomorrow. I got to tell you something. You're on the verge of something amazing. But your fear of failure and being a disappointment is really getting in the way. Why are you so afraid? What happened to us? When did you become so unsure of yourself? What was it that made you feel like you weren't good enough for everybody? Was it because you thought you weren't talented or pretty enough? Was it because you didn't have a voice? You weren't allowed to be you? Was it because no one was interested in you? Why did you spend so much time with Fred, our cat? Why did you bury every dead thing you found in the yard? When did you stop praying to God? When did you start feeling unloved, like a burden? I know you tried to be as good as you could, but it really did get you nowhere because you were constantly reminded of your shortcomings. I'm sorry you never felt like you belonged, but we can start over because it's too heavy to carry anymore. And my body, our adult body, is tired. She's burnt out and can't carry all of that hurt anymore. Remember how we could never run for long, but we could walk forever? Let's try and start there again. Instead, this time, let's walk with Jesus because he really wants us and he's not afraid to show us like mom and dad were. I don't think you were always like this. I think you started out happy, but this world has a way of stealing our joy and peace. I promise you, if you stick with Jesus, he'll get that back for us and so much more. Hey, I love you. I'm sorry I was so mean to you.
Hey, there's someone behind the scenes that does not want to be acknowledged, but really needs to, and that's Steve Copeland, the operational director of DWCC, and with Barbara Malmberg, done all the legwork for making today possible and making things run smoothly. So thank you, Steve, and thank you, Barbara, for filling in all my mistakes. But there's two other groups we need to thank especially, and that's Canadian Mental Health Association and Hotel 2 Grace Hospital. Both organizations over the 2 years have been so significant in helping and encouraging us. And we're just going to hear one message, and then I've got a few other words just to say after that. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Patrick Kolowitz, and I'm the Director for Mental Health and Addictions here at Hotel 2 Grace Healthcare. Within my role here at Hotel 2 Grace Healthcare, I also operate our Mental Health and Addictions Patient and Family Engagement Council. The purpose of our Mental Health and Addictions Patient and Family Engagement Council is to ultimately co-create services in collaboration with patients and families, as they are most in tune to the needs of individuals within our community. One of our members, Clemenza, had an idea to give back or appreciate those who are caring for those with mental illness. Often, family members who care for those with mental illness are frequently challenged with burden and difficulties in terms of navigating the mental health and addiction system, and frequently look to others and experts for sources of support. And initially, Clemence's idea was to host a conference targeted at family members who care for those with mental illness. And the purpose of the conference would be to help prepare individuals or families, help equip them with different tools and resources that they could use in their journey to take care of their loved one with mental illness. Little did we know that COVID would happen soon after our plans to have an in-person conference. So this slightly derailed the initial idea to have an in-person conference. However, it also gave us the opportunity to look more closely at the needs. And essentially what happened was, what was first an idea to just host an in-person conference actually became more of a formalized research study in partnership with Hotel Dieu and the University of Windsor. And so what we set out to do was to better understand the needs of our patients and families, in particular families who care for those with mental illness. And so we collaborated again with the University of Windsor, and there was a survey that went out to individuals to participate, and over 70 caregivers were interviewed extensively to better understand what their needs were around mental health and addiction and caring for someone with mental health and addiction. 2 years later, with a lot of planning and coordination, we've developed a 2-day conference, and the 2-day conference will be held on October 16th and 23rd, and it'll be all exclusively virtual, and it's open to any patient or family with a mental health and or addiction issue within their family, where they assume a role of a caregiver. Without further ado, we will be hosting the Caring for the Caregiver Conference on October 16th and 23rd. It'll be all virtual. You can register for the event in 2 ways, either through the Hotel Dieu website, www.hdgh.org, or our proud sponsor, WeSpark, through their website. So on behalf of Hotel Dieu, our Mental Health and Patient and Family Engagement Council, and our proud sponsors, we are happy and excited to offer the Caring for the Caregiver Conference, which will be held October 16th and 23rd. We hope to see you there, and we thank all of those caregivers who spent the time and commitment to initially identify the needs of our community, and we hope that we can help to address them. Thank you.
Again, our thanks to Hotel Dieu Grace Hospital and CMHA for sponsoring these workshops here today and next Thursday. We're going to step now back into Tim Fletcher's second presentation. So take it away, please, Tim.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so I want to keep going with the consequences of complex PTSD. And what I want you to know up front is that there's way more consequences than I'm going to give you today. I'm just wanting to touch in on the big ones and mainly the brain-related ones, and the research that's come out around that. For your information, I've just put together 2 tests. One is, how can I tell if I have complex PTSD? And it's a 64-question test that people can take. And it's actually going to be on our YouTube channel this Friday night at 7:30 streaming, if people want to watch it. And it's Tim Fletcher Company YouTube channel. And then next Friday night, we're going to do the second test, which is how can I tell if my family had the characteristics that would create complex trauma. So the first one is 64 questions looking at my characteristics of life today that would indicate I might have trauma. The second one is characteristics in my upbringing that could have set me up for complex trauma. And it's got 64 questions as well. So if you're interested in kind of more information or taking those tests, those will be available for you. So the fifth result that we're going to focus on today is dysregulation. And basically what that is all about is complex trauma results in the stress system remaining activated. So it's dysregulated. It's not, your body's not regulated as far as how it's responding emotionally, because it's constantly feeling in danger. It's constantly feeling in fight or flight. So just very quickly, and I'm going to try to get through this quickly because there's quite a bit of material. What causes our body to feel dysregulated or want to go to an alarmed state? So there's basically, our body has internal systems and external systems that are constantly evaluating how we're doing to see if we're safe. So you think of our internal systems. Our brain has a thing that says your body needs this much water to be healthy. So if that is out of balance, if that's not where it should be, it sends out an alarm called thirst, so that dysregulates us so that we will fix it and be regulated again. If we're looking at our external environment, we have sensors on our skin for hot and cold. And if they're below or above a certain range, then an alarm goes off. Our body is dysregulated, so we'll take action to get back in balance and have the right amount of clothing or get out of the heat. So those are happening in our physical body, but there's an awareness in our emotional world of whether all of our emotional needs are being met. Our spiritual, our intellectual, our relational connection needs. Our brain is monitoring all the time whether they're in the right balance. And if they're not, it sends out an alarm. So that is the first thing that activates our stress system. And our body has hundreds of systems in place to constantly monitor those things. So a key one that causes us to be dysregulated is when we don't feel connected. So we need to feel connection to be able to regulate. And so you think of it starts in childhood. A child comes into the world not able to handle the problems of a world, not able to feed themselves, not able to deal with their thirst or their hunger. So they send out an alarm of crying. And the only way that gets them back into balance and the only way that helps them to regulate is if they're connected to a parent that loves them and comes and meets their need. So connection becomes a critical part of what a child needs to remain regulated because they can't do it themselves. They need an outside person. Third thing that causes us to be dysregulated or our stress system to be activated is external danger. So an outside environment that's not safe. Next one becomes more subtle. It's building stress. So getting to the point where the stress starts to feel too much, overwhelming, then our stress system is activated and we feel dysregulated. It's very subtle end of that. Anytime we go through change or unknown or into new surroundings, our stress system is regulated because it's new territory. It has to check out before it can relax and feel safe. And so that's one of the reasons why COVID's been difficult for people with trauma, because all of a sudden there's an unknown in their world that is very scary, and there's a bunch of changes, and it activates their stress system. And then the next one is a memory or anything that triggers a past trauma, and it could be intrinsic memory. They don't even have a conscious memory of it, but their body or their emotions has a memory of it, and it gets triggered. And so all of a sudden they're shaking, but they don't know why, because they don't have a conscious memory, but stuff has been triggered. Or the final one is they're hanging around somebody who's dysregulated. And so it's basically emotions are contagious. So if you're around somebody who's in full-blown fear and panic, it tends to activate your stress system and dysregulate you. So those are all the things that activate our stress system. And people with complex trauma, you can realize they can have their stress system, even when they're back into safety, they can have it reactivated through many, many means. So that means they are getting triggered sometimes 50 times a day, 100 times a day, even though they're in a safe environment because of all the past stuff. So I talked about how do we learn to regulate? A baby cries out, a parent responds. So what has to happen when the parent responds? The need gets met, they soothe the child, and they connect with the child. So those three pieces become the basis for regulation: meeting the need, soothing, connection. So the parent basically is providing external regulation until the child learns how to meet their own needs, soothe themselves, and connect with others, so they can regulate themselves. So a child doesn't come in the world with any tools for regulating their emotions. It's learned by how their parents respond to them. And that's part of the problem with complex trauma, because if the parent doesn't respond because they're too busy or they're wrapped up in their addiction, then the child just becomes more dysregulated. Or if the parent responds by being angry and dysregulated themselves, it causes the child to be more dysregulated. So complex trauma always leads to children who don't know how to regulate themselves, which is an activated stress response system. So let me give you some of the research, and Bruce Perry cites this, but it's helpful when you think of helping people with trauma learn how to regulate their own stress response system. And this is a key part of the healing journey for people who are coming out of complex trauma. So what was the soothing thing for a baby that helped regulate them? And so what they're finding is that the fetus in the womb was hearing a mother's heartbeat at 60 to 80 beats per minute, but that heartbeat was also causing the amniotic fluid to vibrate. So they were feeling the vibrations. So it was a multi-sensory type of soothing effect. So the womb with 60 to 80 beats a minute with the vibration was a very safe place. It kept them regulated. And then when the child is born and the child starts to cry, what they're finding is what helps the child to become regulated is soothing rocking at 60 to 80 beats a minute, so that they begin, the subconscious brain ties into the fetus memory of that rhythm. And that helps the child to relax, to stop crying, to regulate them. Or they've found that music that has a steady rhythm can also trigger that same memory and have a very regulating, soothing effect. Beyond that, what they're now finding is walking has a rhythm, dancing has a rhythm, a massage, yoga is a big one that has a rhythm. Marathon running, they're finding has tremendous effects for people with trauma. But even doodling on a piece of paper has a rhythm, or needing to clean because that has a rhythm. All of those things have a rhythm element. And so that is what people often are doing as a way to try to soothe. So they're finding that then connection, of course, meeting the needs. But then there's a fourth thing that's beginning to be found is when the infant was crying because they were hungry, not only were they crying, but there was oxytocin being released in their brain, which made them reach out to mom and dad as soon as they came in the room. And oxytocin was being released in mom and dad when they heard their infant crying, which was making them want to hug their child and meet their needs and take care of them. So they're finding there was a chemical that was released that was going to help resolve the problem and lead to the regulation. And then as the child gets older, there's cortisol released, which gives them the energy to fix the problem, to fight or flight, so that then they can be regulated again. So oxytocin and cortisol were designed to have a medication effect that was to lead ultimately to being regulated again. So that's important in light of what I'm going to now talk to you about is, okay, complex trauma now messes all of this up. It messes all four of the regulatory systems up. So the first is to understand how the brain processes information. So I've got a picture. Our brain develops first in the brain stem. That's the first part of the brain, which we call the reptilian brain. And that regulates all of our organs, all of our subconscious functioning, our breathing, our digestion, our blood pressure, our heartbeat, all controlled by the brain stem. And then the limbic brain is the emotional part of the brain, the survival part of the brain that develops in childhood. And the focus is instant safety, instant pleasure, gratification. It thinks very short term. And then the cortex is the smartest part of the brain, but it's the part that develops last. So what you realize is for a child or an infant, they basically have the brainstem and the limbic brain as what is processing information. And so what they've discovered is that the brain processes information from the bottom up. So when our five senses and our internal regulatory senses perceive an alarm system, something's wrong, it doesn't process it at the cortex first. It starts at the brain stem and processes it upwards. So then what you need to understand is the brain stem can't tell time. The cortex is the only part of the brain that can tell time. So the brain stem, what happened 50 years ago, doesn't matter. If something happens today that corresponds to 50 years ago, it feels that what happened 50 years ago is happening today. It does not tell time. So the brain, from the brain stem to the cortex, all of it is consistently working to organize my life and make sense out of it. So if somebody wags their finger at me, does that mean they're angry at me? Does that mean they're just making a point? Are they safe? Are they not? And so it's taking its history and making sense out of that body language. And that gets put into the brain stem and the limbic brain for the young child. Loud noises, a yell, it makes sense out of all of that. A rub on the back, a massage, does that mean comfort or sexual abuse is coming? So the brain is constantly processing everything, creating memories, organizing it into safe or unsafe categories. So the five senses and the internal are all processing from the bottom up in light of that. So here's the problem with complex trauma. So let's say 30 years ago, a guy's in Vietnam, constant warfare, or I guess that'd be even longer than 30 years ago now. But loud noises, guns going off, cannons going off, never dealt with it. So now they are, when we had the 4th of July, July 1st fireworks, they hear a loud bang of fireworks. Remember, the brain processes from the bottom up. The cortex says, that reminds me of Vietnam, and they go into a PTSD, fight, flight, freeze response. They're triggered. The brain doesn't, the cortex or the brainstem doesn't tell time, and they are in full-blown PTSD relapse mode. Complex trauma then, because of all the years of the brainstem interpreting all kinds of things in life that said, this is dangerous, this is dangerous, this is dangerous. Now, when something happens in their existence today, bottom-up processing, they hear, feel, see something, reaction happens before the cortex is even involved to analyze, is it the same? Now, it will eventually get to the cortex where they can process it. But what is important to understand is they are already in fight, flight, freeze mode before it gets to the cortex. So they can go back to old behaviors because they haven't learned how to regulate the brainstem and the limbic brain yet. And so part of the first steps in the healing process is learning to regulate the limbic brain and the brainstem. Later, you can work on the cortex, but you have to start with helping people regulate that limbic brain. And so that is just a huge thing. So just a couple of things around. Most people with complex trauma will use some of the tools for regulation, but they won't work perfectly. So you will get clients who will self-soothe. They will rock back and forth. They will curl up in the fetal position. They will tap on the table. It's partly effective, but it's not totally effective because the need's not being met and they're not connecting. So they're missing the two other ingredients of regulation. Others, they will try to connect with a person, but that person isn't safe. And so they partly feel good because they connected with an abusive person, but it does more damage at the same time. And so that is what happens for many people from complex trauma. They try connecting with people who further abuse them. But here's what I want you to see around the medication part. What they found is when a child is in fight or flight, cortisol is released. And cortisol, it puts sugar into the muscles, it sends blood out into the muscles so that they have extra energy and strength to fight or flight. So the body responds to the cortisol by giving extra help. What happens if the child is too little to fight or too little to flee? It has to go to the third response, which is freeze, and the body changes its total response. Now it doesn't do the cortisol. Now it begins to release natural opioids. And what it's doing is preparing the body to get hurt. And it takes blood out of the muscles and it brings them around into the heart so that if they get hurt, cut, they won't bleed as badly. It protects them. It's into self-protection, but they also dissociate. They retreat into a safe inner world. They can't do anything about their external world. They can't prevent it by fight or flight. So let's retreat into an internal world. And so that can be fantasy, total dissociation, dissociative identity disorder comes out of extreme things. And then they go to a fourth response, which is fawning. And fawning means people pleasing. So I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt me. I'll be super kind, super pleasing. And so you got that in the slave culture. Yes, master, yes, master, yes, master. Just don't hurt me. I'll do whatever you want. And so that is the shift that happens when you can no longer fight or flight. So what happens for a person who has that on a daily basis as a child and they get stuck in the freeze mode and now they're an adult, they still need the opioids to cope. They need to dissociate from their world. And so that's where you get people who will cut, because cutting or burning or banging your head releases opioids. So people go, why do people cut? Isn't that painful? Actually, for them, it takes the pain away. It releases the opioids. Or they go into your fentanyl world, your morphine world, your heroin world, all your opioid world, because that becomes their way of regulation. It lets their stress response system relax. And so addiction becomes a very important piece for many people who were in freeze mode in their childhood to continue a way to regulate their emotions today. So this I found extremely interesting. So this basically says the brain state, so on the top on the dark blue line, the brain state, so is it calm, alert, alarm, fear, or in terror? So 5 different possible brain states. And then, so if we take the first one, the dominant brain that's functioning in that state. So the ideal is calm. So when you're calm, you're in your cortex. That's when the cortex functions. So go below that to the adaptive. There's an arousal or an energetic, or there's a dissociative or a relax state. So what's when the cortex, you're calm, you're safe, you're feeling good. Then in the energy state, you can be creative. When you're in the relaxed state, you can daydream, you can just go into a daydream world. And that becomes your brain's state in the cortex. Then cognition, you can deal with the realities of life, but you can also deal with abstract. When you're in a relaxed place, you can dream of things. You can think of new ways of looking at things. You can go into an abstract world. And so what they find is that when the brain isn't calm, the IQ for most people is 100 to 120. So that's your smartest time. That's when your brain is functioning the best, okay? So let's go to your brain is activated in the alert system. So it's on guard. It's not sure totally if you're in danger yet. It's just on guard. So now your limbic is in there with your cortex. And then we have what's called a flock, which now as I'm hypervigilant, I'm looking around me, but I'm also checking out how other people in the flock are responding to see if they're picking up danger as well. Then my natural adaptation is I want to start avoiding. I got to get out of here. What do I need to do to escape this? And so my thinking now gets more concrete. So what you're seeing is you're starting into survival mode. You're not totally in survival mode, but you are now thinking more and more in terms of survival. And so it's limbic and cortex now activated. So your IQ actually drops when you're in that mode. Go to the next one. If you're in alarm state, okay, there is danger. It's clear. This is not safe. So you're now limbic. Your cortex, cortisol is firing, and that shuts down your cortex because it's basically saying we don't have time to think right now about options. We got to get out of here. So you either are fighting, resistant, or I'm out of here, or I'm not complying. I'm fighting all the time. You're driven by emotions now. Anger takes over, fear takes over. And because you're totally now limbic, your IQ dropped again. Fear, now you are full of panic. So now your brainstem gets introduced. So that's where, if you go to the next one, terror, when it's full-blown terror, notice when you get to the dissociation adaptation, freeze, that's where people faint, or they wet themselves, or they lose control of their bowels, or they just collapse, they're weak in the knees, because their brain stem is reserving all energy into your core. It is saying, let's get rid of all unnecessary functions right now outside of the minimal requirement for survival. So we're going to empty our bowels, our bladder. We're going to faint. We're not going to be able to stand because we got to curl up into a ball here just to survive. So what you see is the greater the trauma, the lower into your brain you go, and the lower your IQ gets. So in the terror mode, you are functioning at an animal rate of 60 to 80% or 80% IQ. So that again is just to give you kind of what is going on in the brain as the stress activation system gets further and further alarmed until it reaches a terror state. Okay. Number 6, I'm going to try to include a whole bunch of stuff, and either Bob or Steve stop me when the time is up, because I may not get through everything. So there's ongoing danger equals an ongoing activated stress response system, which means ongoing cortisol. So Dr. Gabor Mate has done a book called When the Body Says No. And basically, it's about what happens when you have ongoing cortisol in the body, because the body was not made for ongoing cortisol. It was made for cortisol to happen only very, very occasionally and only for short bursts of time so that you could fight or flight. Complex trauma, you got cortisol happening all the time. So what they're finding is it burns the corpus callosum in the brain, and the corpus callosum joins the right lobe to the left lobe of the brain. And that corpus callosum enables you to remember the full events of a memory, both details and emotions. And when the corpus callosum is burned, you now get memory gaps. And so most people with complex trauma have huge memory gaps. Then it leads to a whole bunch of mental health issues or disorders. So depression disorders, anxiety disorders. And so what they're saying is 90% of Western illness is due to suppressed cortisol. Heart disease, blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune disease. They're now seeing a cortisol connection to all of those things. Next one, which is to me key, is sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic nervous system. So it changes our autonomic nervous system. So let me give this very quickly, and then I think we might have to quit. So our sympathetic nervous system is one part of our autonomic nervous system, and then the parasympathetic, they're designed to work in balance. So the sympathetic nervous system is to give us energy, to produce, to be safe, to fight, to flight. It is it's activated to give energy. The parasympathetic is designed to kick in to let us rest, to rejuvenate. And so it's the balancing thing. And so if we're to be healthy, we need to use our sympathetic in balance with our parasympathetic. Otherwise, we burn out. So what happens in complex trauma is your sympathetic nervous system is going constantly because you're constantly in danger. Your parasympathetic is never allowed to kick in because you're not allowed to rest or drop your guard. And so what happens if you have a sympathetic nervous system, and I put a diagram here of what the two do in the body. You can look at that later. But if the sympathetic nervous system has to be operating all the time, it has to get energy. So first of all, it uses the food we have, the fat reserves we have, then it uses cortisol, adrenaline, and then people actually turn to drugs or stimulant drugs in order to give them the energy to keep functioning, to keep going, to stay on guard. But the problem is it's also creating huge emotional issues, anxiety issues and anger issues. And so it's characterized by excess energy, trouble sleeping, overactive mind, difficulty being present to people, and hypervigilance. That's an overactive sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic can't interject itself to keep you from destroying yourself. So what it does before you destroy yourself is, what they're finding is one purpose for depression is your parasympathetic nervous system trying to get you to slow down. And so it's the first attempt for people with a constant sympathetic nervous system to get them to slow down. And so depression kicks in to try to help. But people then turn to drugs just to keep going. And so then the parasympathetic does the next thing. Well, then we're going to burn out or have a breakdown. That will shut you down. That will shut down the sympathetic nervous system. Others say, I got to go, but I'm going to plan my break. So I'm going to use heroin every week on the weekend just to take a break and then go back to my sympathetic nervous system. But drugs are going to be the way to engage my parasympathetic nervous system. So that is what begins to happen. And then what I have seen, and I don't know the medical terminology for it, I just call it, what happens for people who've lived like that for years is that their body actually develops an allergy to cortisol. So now, instead of, if they're in danger, instead of cortisol giving them energy, it makes them feel like they got hit by a truck. They just feel zero energy. It sucks everything out of them. It has the reverse effect. Okay, we got one more thing, but I think we better get back to Steve there.
Do we have time for a couple questions, Steve?
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a couple in the chat. Kristen, are you able to?
Got it. Yes, got it. And thank you again, Tim, so much. And just for everyone joining us today, I find the more I learn about complex trauma, the more I just feel like, you know, this is not just a side note. This is really critical information for those trying to heal and those working where they're helping others to heal. So really grateful for everyone here and for you sharing that. Okay, so going to the chat with the question. So first one, just wondering if there is a relation with complex trauma with a child who has experienced a traumatic birth. Example, during labor, shortly after birth, being in NICU, undergoing tests, etc., that prevents the parent from meeting the infant's need at the beginning of their life. However, once returned home, is in a loving environment, can this traumatic experience at birth have a negative impact later in life?
It's an excellent question. Dr. Gabor Mate and Dr. Bruce Perry have both present research that is being done now on trauma in the womb and trauma at birth. So what they're seeing is if the child is in the womb, but the mother's stress system is activated all the time, that does affect the fetus. And so the mother's emotional state during her pregnancy and the events in childbirth can have a trauma effect on the fetus. And that, I would say that they're still in the early stages of research, but from what is coming out in being able to look at brains, they're starting to see a connection.
Thank you. All right, a couple more questions here. What are some resources to further research the body's physical responses to fight, flight, or freeze, or further research brain states?
Okay. So again, I've mentioned Bruce Perry and Dr. Gabor Mate. Other leaders are Bezo van der Kolk, who's done some excellent work on trauma. I'm trying to remember the name of his book, but it's very, very good. And then Peter Levine and Peter Walker have done some excellent stuff on therapy. And now some of their kind of students have taken it even further. And there's some really good books out by some of their students. So I would say in the last 5 years, this whole field of study is really starting to grow. And in the last 2 years, some really books are coming out. And so those would be the main authors that I would steer a person to initially for more information. Body keeps the score. Thank you, Margot.
Thanks for that. And we'll do one more question, and then we will wrap up for today and look forward to seeing everyone next week. So what are your thoughts about neurofeedback? For example, what about brainwave deregulation due to trauma?
Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to be covering that next Thursday. That's going to be part of the discussion around the healing. So can I, because I said in the first half to one of the questions that I was going to answer one of the questions in the second half, and that's in the final point. So if I can go back to that, that's not going to let me. Okay, so let me just do this. Dr. Bruce Lipton is another neuroscientist who's done a ton of work that's been very helpful, especially in understanding complex trauma. And so my slides aren't working. Basically, it's our brain has got a subconscious element and a conscious element. So the subconscious element, let me do this. Okay. So the subconscious element is the main part of the brain, and it processes 40 million bits of data a second, which is a ton of data. And so if you think of your eyes, they send through all of the optic nerve 10 million bits of data a second. You look at the 5 external senses and all the internal senses: cold, hot, scratch, itch, cut, blister, bug. All of those constant messages going to the brain subconsciously. 40 million bits of information a second are being processed by that part of the brain. But there's a second thing that happens in the subconscious brain, and that's the making sense out of your life. So we talked about that. So you think of learning to drive a standard car or learning to drive or ride a bicycle. At first, your conscious brain is frustrated because it takes so much work to get all lined up, pedaling, steering, balancing, changing gears in a car, brake, etc. But eventually, the more you do it, it goes into your subconscious brain as a fixed circuit in your brain that you do on autopilot. It becomes a program in your brain that begins to happen. So that then is happening in thousands of areas. So your brain is saying every time you hear a cry, what's your history say about a cry? If your dad is drunk, what's your history say? So you've got a subconscious full of how your brain has organized your history to make sense out of it, which is beliefs, all kinds of autopilot. The conscious brain only processes 40 bits of data a second, 1 million times slower, which is amazing. So your subconscious brain, isn't creative. It just processes history. Your conscious brain is the only part of your brain that has a free will that can change anything. Your subconscious brain just reproduces everything based on the old autopilot, okay? The problem is 1 to 5% of our time in a day is in our conscious brain. 95 to 99% of our behavior is controlled by our subconscious brain, by autopilot. So you can get up in the morning, make coffee, get cereal, whatever, and not even be thinking about it because you're in autopilot mode, subconscious brain. So the tragedy of complex trauma is it trains your subconscious brain with a faulty program. So if this happens, respond this way. If this happens, responds this way. And since 95 to 99% of our time is in our subconscious brain, we operate and respond without even being aware of how we're responding or why we're responding. So the problem becomes in helping people with complex trauma is how do you get the subconscious autopilot, which is a faulty program, change to a healthy program. So it's like learning to ride a new bicycle. So if you learn to ride a bicycle where you turned your handlebars to the right and you went right, now at, let's say, 50 years of age, after doing that for 45 years, we give you a bicycle where if you turn your handlebars to your right, you turn left. How long would it take you to learn to ride that bicycle? And what they're finding is 6 months to a year, where you are concentrating every day on turn right means turn left. Problem is, once you start to do that and somebody says, hey, you, how are you doing? You go back to autopilot. And then you go back to the old program and you crash. And so what we're finding with complex trauma is when your entire autopilot is faulty programming, it takes 2 to 10 years to reprogram that. And that means bringing the subconscious world through self-awareness to the conscious mind, learning new tools, learning what healthy looks like, beginning to consciously change that while slipping back to autopilot all the time, but consciously coming out of that, keep changing, keep changing. So it's a very slow, frustrating, messy process. Okay, I'm done.
The brain is an amazing, it's just awesome. That's unbelievable. And Tim, that's an amazing teaser for next week.
Can I jump in? We found
Sure.
when we did this conversation 2 years ago that we did a full day of this and everyone was like full by lunch. And so we said, let's split it up into 2 conversations a week apart, and you can digest this conversation for the week and then come back next week ready for more of it. So that's the encouragement and the invite.
And also there's space for more. So if you're somebody at work or you're connected with in any of your agencies, they can register. If they weren't registered for today, they can register for next week as well. And just have them start running, you know, the treadmill's on fast, and just jump on and participate. So it's almost 12 o'clock. Just want to thank folks. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Leslie, for participating and sharing from your experience and expertise and passion. Also to CMHA and Hotel du Grace for sponsoring, making this possible. And then for Kristen for moderating, and Alex and Steve for and Barbara for being in a sense behind the scenes to make it run smoothly. But even more so for you, thank you for participating and being involved in this, and encouragement to us. We want to continue to hear your feedback through the week, as well as on next Thursday. React Windsor Essex is going to be celebrating its first anniversary, October 5th. It's just been less than a year, and the response has been overwhelming and encouraging. So thank you for the community support that's making it happen. We provide it free to folks to try to remove the barriers for access to participation in there. So look forward to you being involved in it next week. Same time, same code for being involved. And hope you have a wonderful afternoon and get a chance for your parasympathetic to give yourself a little break after the intensity of the morning. So thanks very much, everybody.